The recent attack in New Orleans, carried out by Shamsuddin Jabbar, is a tragedy that has shocked the vibrant city. Until recently, the threat of terror felt like a distant memory. Yet in truth, such violence had continued in the Middle East and Africa despite having briefly receded in the West since 2016. In the aftermath of any terrorist attack, we often turn to experts as we seek out explanations for senseless violence. But how reliable are these explanations if they are drawn on outdated ideas? We ask ourselves how tragedies such as that seen in New Orleans just days ago could happen, and we ask ourselves if anyone could have prevented it. When such questions are asked, one concept will inevitably dominate the proposed answers. This concept both limits and defines how we understand the crime of terrorism. That word is radicalization. As so-called terrorism experts play detective with the digital clues left by Jabbar, the accuracy of the concept of radicalization is mostly taken for granted. Despite widespread use of the term, this concept that has been subject to scrutiny for some time. Critics suggest it distorts the cognitive processes that lead up to a terrorist act, and distract preventative efforts by focusing too heavily on ideology. Indeed, what we know so far about the New Orleans attack reveals that we need to reassess how we process violence. People use the word radicalization without question. This label is used in the study of terrorism, by law enforcement, and by the average citizen. Radicalization describes the process where someone starts believing extreme things and decides violence is how they will get what they want. This idea has defined how we fight terrorism and has limited our capacity to truly understand the drivers of violence. Radicalization seems like a simple answer. A person changes their mind, believes something extreme, and then becomes violent. But this simple answer isn't the whole story. Instead, by focusing too much on radicalization, we have failed to see all the other reasons why terrorism happens. People who use the concept of radicalization believe that dangerous ideas are a primary cause of terrorism. They think that seeing or hearing extremist messages, online or from friends, can leave them vulnerable to becoming terrorists. Ideas can be powerful, but the overemphasis on ideology has severely oversimplified things. People are complicated. They have lots of reasons for what they do. Someone can have extreme beliefs but never hurt anyone. Others might become terrorists without really believing in any specific ideology. Sometimes people who are easily influenced are looking for a group to belong to, a purpose, or even revenge. But the concept of radicalization minimizes this nuance. One of the core problems with radicalization is that it makes us think we can predict who will become a terrorist. Radicalization theory fools us into believing that we can find people who are vulnerable to becoming radicalized and stop them before they hurt anyone. This idea has led to government overreach and the expansion of preemptive laws, large-scale wars and invasions, and aggressive militarized counter-terrorism policing measures. But even after lots of research and money spent, we still can't tell for sure who will become a terrorist. Radicalization theory has contributed to binary thinking and an us versus them mentality. This division is often based on religion, culture, or beliefs, separating the world into moderates versus extremists, or the West versus the rest. But people are more complex than that. They can have different ideas at the same time, and their beliefs can change over time. Also, this us versus them thinking ignores the many people who have radical beliefs but never hurt anyone, as well as those who become terrorists without following any particular ideology. This kind of thinking can lead to discrimination against entire groups of people based on their religion, ethnicity, or political views. This can include things like unfair surveillance and other forms of mistreatment, which only alienates and marginalizes vulnerable populations. Instead of using this divisive language, we need to better understand the factors that contribute to terrorism and recognize that both the perpetrators and victims of violence are human beings. Since radicalization theory has limitations, we need to find new ways to understand the complex phenomenon of terrorism. There are some promising approaches from fields like sociology, psychology, political science, and anthropology. One approach focuses on social identity and how groups influence individual behavior. This idea suggests that people are more likely to be violent when they strongly identify with a group that encourages or accepts violence. This group identity can give them a sense of purpose, belonging, and importance, especially if they feel like they don't belong in mainstream society. Another approach looks at how inequality and political grievances can lead people to extremism. This perspective highlights how things like poverty, discrimination, political oppression, and state violence can create an environment where radicalization can happen. It's also important to consider the specific events and opportunities that lead individuals to engage in violence. By considering these alternative frameworks, we can move beyond the limitations of radicalization theory and develop a more nuanced understanding of the complex interplay of factors that contribute to terrorism. The New Orleans attack, a tragic reminder of the devastating consequences of political violence, forces us to rethink how we understand terrorism. While the idea of radicalization has been important for decades, its flaws are becoming more and more clear. Focusing too much on ideology, trying to predict who will be violent, ignoring bigger problems, and thinking in terms of us versus them, have made it harder to effectively address the root causes of terrorism. We need a new approach to counterterrorism, one that recognizes the complexity of the issue and takes a more holistic perspective. This means looking beyond ideology. Understanding that while ideology can be a factor, it's rarely the only or even the main reason for terrorism. Giving up on predicting violence, focusing instead on understanding and addressing the underlying conditions that make individuals and communities vulnerable to radicalization. Fixing structural inequalities. Creating policies that promote social and economic justice, ensure equal opportunities, and address grievances. Rejecting us versus them thinking. Recognizing the shared humanity of all individuals and engaging with diverse communities to build understanding and resist extremist narratives. By remembering how our policies and flawed ideas have failed us in the past, we can move beyond the limitations of radicalization theory and develop more effective strategies to prevent terrorism and build a more just and secure world for everyone.